The large city music hall was already full long before the competition began. People slowly filled the seats while quiet piano notes echoed from the stage as technicians checked the sound one last time. Parents whispered to their children. Teachers spoke calmly with their students. And the judges sat at a long table near the front with serious expressions. Everyone knew this was an important competition. Many talented young pianists had come from different towns and schools, hoping that today would be the day their music would be noticed. Outside the hall, the morning air was cool and calm. A small car stopped near the entrance. A teenage girl stepped out slowly, holding a worn music notebook close to her chest. Her clothes were simple and neat, nothing like the fancy outfits many performers wore at events like this. Her mother followed behind her, carrying a small bag and looking around the busy entrance with quiet curiosity. For a moment the girl simply stood there, staring at the tall building. She had seen pictures of it before, but standing in front of it felt very different. The hall looked huge, almost intimidating. Through the glass doors she could see crowds of people moving inside. Her heart began beating faster. Her mother gently placed a hand on her shoulder and smiled. It was a small gesture, but it helped. The girl took a deep breath and they walked toward the entrance together. Inside the building the sound of conversation filled the air. Contestants sat in different corners warming up their fingers on small practice keyboards. Some teachers were giving last-minute advice. Others were reviewing sheet music again and again as if one more look might make the performance perfect. The girl noticed how confident many of the other participants seemed. Some of them were wearing formal suits or elegant dresses. A few had thick folders filled with complicated classical pieces. She quietly held her small notebook and wondered if she truly belonged in a place like this. They walked to the registration desk where a volunteer greeted them with a friendly smile. The volunteer asked for the contestant's name and checked a long list before handing over a number card. The girl thanked her politely and pinned the number to her dress. Nearby, two other contestants glanced at her for a moment. Their expressions showed mild curiosity, but they quickly returned to their own conversations. The girl lowered her eyes slightly, not wanting to draw attention to herself. Her mother guided her to a row of chairs along the wall. They sat quietly while the room slowly grew louder with anticipation. From the stage area came the strong sound of a grand piano being tested. Each deep note vibrated through the hall like a powerful heartbeat. The girl closed her eyes for a moment and listened carefully. The sound reminded her of home. At home, the piano was very different. It was old and slightly out of tune. Some keys were softer than others. A few made faint clicking sounds when pressed. But to her, it was still beautiful. It was the instrument she had practiced on for years, late at night and early in the morning. She remembered sitting at that piano during quiet evenings while rain tapped gently on the window. Sometimes she practiced simple exercises. Other times she experimented with melodies she had heard during the day. Music had always felt like a place where she could express thoughts that were hard to say out loud. A voice from the stage interrupted her memories. The host of the competition stepped forward and greeted the audience. His voice carried clearly across the hall. He welcomed everyone and explained how the competition would work. Each contestant would have a chance to perform while the judges carefully listened and scored the performance. The girl looked toward the stage. The grand piano stood at the center under bright lights. It looked far more polished and powerful than the piano she practiced on at home. For a brief moment she wondered how it would feel to play it. The first contestant was called to the stage. A confident young pianist walked forward and sat at the bench without hesitation. Within seconds the hall filled with fast and complex music. The performer's fingers moved quickly across the keys, playing a famous classical piece that many people recognized. The audience responded with strong applause when the performance ended. The second contestant followed with another impressive piece. Then another. Each performer seemed well-trained and highly prepared. The music grew more dramatic with every performance. The girl watched quietly, her hands resting in her lap. Her mother occasionally squeezed her hand gently, offering silent encouragement. Time passed slowly as more contestants performed. Some pieces were powerful and intense. Others were soft and emotional. The judges listened carefully, writing notes after every performance. Backstage assistants occasionally appeared near the waiting area to call the next performer. As the girl listened, she noticed something interesting. Many of the performances were technically perfect, but they felt similar to one another. They were impressive, yet somehow predictable. She looked down at her small notebook again. Inside it was a very simple melody she had practiced many times. It was not difficult or complex. In fact, many beginners learned it during their first year of piano lessons. But she loved that melody because it left space for creativity. Over time she had started experimenting with it, gently changing the rhythm or adding new harmonies. She never planned to perform those ideas in front of anyone. They were simply something she enjoyed while practicing. Now she wondered if today might be different. Another contestant finished performing and received warm applause. The host looked down at the list again. "Next performer," he announced. The girl heard her number. For a moment everything around her felt very quiet, even though the hall was still full of people. Her heart began beating faster again. Her mother looked at her with calm confidence and gave a small nod. The girl stood up slowly. Her legs felt slightly shaky, but she forced herself to take steady steps toward the stage. As she walked forward, some audience members glanced at the program to see which contestant was performing next. A few judges adjusted their glasses and prepared their score sheets. When she reached the stage, the bright lights made it difficult to see the audience clearly. But she could still feel hundreds of eyes watching her. She sat down at the piano bench and placed her hands gently in her lap. One of the judges looked at her profile sheet for a moment. Then he spoke kindly into the microphone. "You are one of the younger participants today," he said. "So we will begin with something simple. Please play the simplest tune." A few soft murmurs moved through the audience. Some people smiled politely, expecting a short beginner performance. The girl nodded respectfully. She turned slightly toward the piano and placed her fingers on the keys. For a brief second she remembered the quiet evenings at home, the worn piano, and the peaceful moments when music felt effortless. She took a slow breath. Then she played the first note. The sound was soft but clear, floating gently through the hall. Truly was a very simple melody at the beginning. Exactly the kind of tune the judge had requested. But deep inside, the girl knew something the audience did not yet realize. This melody had many possibilities, and she was about to show them. The first note hung softly in the air. It was gentle and clear, almost like a quiet greeting. The audience listened politely, expecting a short and simple performance. After all, the judge had asked for the simplest tune. The girl kept her eyes on the keys. Her fingers moved carefully, pressing each note with calm control. The melody was familiar to many people in the room. Some parents in the audience even smiled because they had heard their own children practice the same tune during beginner lessons. At first it sounded exactly the way everyone expected. Simple, slow, basic. A few people leaned back in their chairs, thinking the performance would be over quickly. One of the judges held his pen ready, prepared to give a polite but average score. But something began to change after the first few lines of the melody. The girl added a slightly longer pause between two notes. It was such a small change that most people did not notice it right away. But that pause made the next note feel warmer and more emotional. Her fingers moved again, still following the original melody, yet shaping it in a different way. The rhythm became softer, almost like someone quietly telling a story. A woman sitting near the middle of the hall slowly leaned forward. The tune was still simple, but now it felt alive. The girl continued playing with calm focus. Her shoulders relaxed as the music flowed more naturally through her hands. It was clear she was no longer thinking about the crowd or the judges. She was simply listening to the music. Another small change appeared in the melody. This time she added a gentle harmony with her left hand. It blended perfectly with the main tune, creating a fuller sound. One of the judges looked up from his paper. The man beside him noticed as well. The melody was no longer just a beginner exercise. The girl slowly built the music step by step. She never rushed. Each note felt carefully placed, as if she was painting a picture with sound. In the audience, whispers that had started earlier faded away. People began listening more closely. The girl's hands moved smoothly across the keyboard. She repeated the melody again, but this time she added a gentle rise in the notes. It sounded hopeful, almost like sunlight appearing after a cloudy morning. Someone in the back row quietly said, "Listen to that." Another listener nodded. The change was subtle but powerful. The girl continued exploring the melody in new ways. Sometimes she softened the notes so much that the music felt like a quiet conversation. Other times she added a slightly stronger chord that gave the tune more depth. None of it sounded forced, felt natural, felt honest. The audience began to realize that this was not an ordinary performance. The simple tune had become something much more meaningful. A young contestant waiting near the side of the stage watched with wide eyes. Earlier, he had been reviewing his own complicated piece again and again. Now he had stopped completely. He was just listening. Back at the judges' table, the expressions on their faces slowly changed. The judge who had first spoken leaned back in his chair, studying the performer more carefully. He had expected a short beginner performance. Instead, he was hearing creativity. The girl moved into the middle part of the melody. This section usually sounded plain when beginners played it, but she turned it into something gentle and emotional by adding soft repeating notes underneath the main tune. The music began to feel deeper. A quiet warmth spread through the hall. Some people closed their eyes while listening. The girl's fingers moved more confidently now. The nervous feeling she had earlier seemed to disappear. Every movement felt natural, almost effortless. She remembered the many evenings she had spent at the old piano at home. Those long hours had not been about winning competitions. They had been about understanding how music could grow from something small into something beautiful. Now she was showing that idea to everyone in the hall. The melody continued to grow. She introduced a soft echo of the tune in the higher notes. It sounded light and floating, like a bird moving across the sky. A quiet murmur passed through the audience again, but this time it was not from boredom. It was surprise. One judge slowly placed his pen down on the table. He no longer needed to write anything yet. He simply wanted to listen. The girl allowed the melody to settle for a moment. The music became quiet again, almost returning to the way it began. For a few seconds it felt as if the piece might end there. But instead she gently shifted into a new variation. The change was smooth and natural, like turning a page in a story. Her left hand created soft rolling chords, while her right hand carried the melody forward. The sound grew fuller, filling the large hall in a warm wave of music. People who had been sitting comfortably earlier now leaned forward with curiosity. Even those who did not know much about piano could feel that something special was happening. The tune they thought they recognized had transformed into something fresh and emotional. The girl never rushed the music. She allowed every note to breathe. The rhythm rose gently and then softened again, like calm waves moving across water. At the back of the hall, a music teacher quietly whispered to the person sitting beside him. "She understands the melody," he said softly. "That's rare." Near the front row, the girl's mother sat very still. Her hands were folded together, but her eyes were full of emotion. She had heard these variations before during practice at home, but hearing them in a large hall with hundreds of listeners felt completely different. The girl continued playing, her focus never leaving the keys. She introduced another gentle harmony, this time deeper and more expressive. The music now carried a feeling of quiet strength. Even the contestants waiting for their turn had gathered near the stage entrance. No one wanted to miss a single note. The melody slowly built toward something larger. The changes were still subtle, but together they created a powerful feeling of movement. It felt as if the simple tune had begun a journey, and the girl was guiding everyone through it. As the music flowed forward, the audience realized something important. The performance was not impressive because it was complicated. It was impressive because it was thoughtful. Every note had meaning. Every pause felt intentional. The girl reached the final section of the melody's main theme. Instead of ending quickly, she gently expanded it once more. The notes rose slightly higher, carrying a sense of quiet hope. The sound of the grand piano filled the hall in a way that felt warm and powerful at the same time. The judges exchanged quick glances with one another. They had heard many talented performers that day, but this moment felt different. The girl pressed a soft chord and allowed it to fade slowly into silence. For a brief moment, the hall was completely still. The melody was not finished yet, but everyone listening could already feel that something unforgettable was unfolding. And the simple tune that had seemed ordinary only minutes earlier was slowly becoming the most memorable music of the entire competition. The soft chord slowly faded into the quiet hall. For a moment it seemed like the music might end there, but the girl did not lift her hands from the keys. She remained still, listening carefully to the silence she had just created. The audience waited. In that silence, something interesting happened. People who had expected a short and simple performance now felt completely focused on what would come next. The pause felt intentional, almost like a deep breath before continuing a story. Then her fingers moved again. This time the melody returned in a slightly different way. The notes were still familiar, but they carried more emotion. It felt warmer, deeper, as if the tune had grown older and wiser during the short time it had been playing. The girl gently pressed a group of soft chords with her left hand, while the right hand carried the melody forward. The sound spread through the hall like a calm wave. It was still simple music, yet it filled the large space with surprising beauty. Several audience members exchanged quick glances. They could feel that the performance was changing again. The girl allowed the melody to travel higher on the keyboard. The notes became lighter and brighter. They floated above the deeper chords below, creating a sound that felt peaceful and hopeful. A man sitting in the second row slowly leaned closer to the stage. Earlier he had been checking his phone during some performances. Now the phone rested forgotten in his pocket. He did not want to miss what was happening. The girl's shoulders remained relaxed. Her breathing matched the rhythm of the music. She looked calm, almost as if she were alone in the room with the piano. But the audience could feel every emotion moving through the melody. At the judges' table, one judge quietly folded his hands together. Another judge nodded slowly as the music continued. They were not just listening for technical accuracy anymore. They were listening for feeling. And this performance had plenty of it. The melody began to grow stronger, not louder in a dramatic way, but fuller and more confident. The girl introduced a gentle repeating pattern in the lower notes. It created a steady rhythm underneath the tune, like footsteps moving forward on a quiet path. With that rhythm supporting the melody, the music began to travel further than before. It no longer sounded like a beginner exercise. It sounded like a small piece of life. The girl repeated the melody again, but this time she added small decorative notes between the main ones. They sparkled softly, giving the tune a new sense of motion. A quiet gasp came from somewhere in the audience. Someone had finally realized just how creative the performance had become. Near the stage entrance, several contestants stood close together watching. Earlier they had been focused on their own upcoming performances. Now their attention was completely captured by the music filling the hall. One of them whispered quietly, "It's the same tune, but it sounds completely different." Another simply nodded in agreement. Back at the piano, the girl gently guided the melody into a calmer section. The rhythm slowed slightly, and the notes softened again. It felt like the music was resting for a moment before continuing its journey. Her fingers moved with quiet confidence across the keys. The large grand piano responded with a rich, warm sound that filled every corner of the hall. The girl remembered the old piano at home again. That instrument had never sounded this powerful. But the feeling was the same. Music had always felt like a conversation between her hands and the keys. Now that conversation was being shared with hundreds of listeners. The melody returned once more, but this time she changed the harmony underneath it. The new chords gave the tune a deeper emotional color. It sounded thoughtful, almost reflective. The audience remained completely silent. No one shifted in their seat. No one whispered. Even the judges seemed to forget about their score sheets for a moment. The girl continued exploring the melody gently, adding just enough change to keep the music fresh, while still honoring the simple tune she had started with. Her movements were graceful but natural. Nothing felt forced or overly dramatic. It was simply music growing from one idea into another. As the melody approached the final part of its journey, the girl introduced a small rising sequence of notes. Each one climbed slightly higher than the last, building a feeling of anticipation. The sound slowly filled the hall with quiet excitement. People could feel that the performance was moving toward something important. The girl allowed the melody to pause again for a brief second. Then she gently brought back the main theme clear and bright. This time it sounded more confident than ever. It was the same simple tune the judge had requested, but it had been transformed through creativity, patience, and emotion. A few audience members began to smile without even realizing it. The music carried a feeling of hope that was easy to understand, even for listeners who knew nothing about piano technique. The girl's hands moved into the final section of the piece. The rhythm became steady and flowing, like a calm river moving toward its destination. Her left hand created warm supporting chords while the right hand allowed the melody to shine clearly above them. The sound of the grand piano now felt powerful but still gentle. It filled the hall with a beautiful balance of strength and softness. At the judges' table, one judge slowly shook his head in quiet disbelief. They had asked for the simplest tune, yet what they were hearing was a performance full of imagination and heart. The girl guided the melody toward its ending with careful control. She did not rush the final moments. Instead, she allowed the music to breathe, letting every note carry its full meaning. The melody rose one last time, reaching a small but shining peak of sound. Then her hands slowly moved down the keyboard, bringing the music gently back to where it began. The final notes were soft and peaceful. They echoed lightly through the hall before fading into silence. The girl held her hands above the keys for a moment longer, allowing the last sound to disappear completely. The entire hall remained silent. No one moved. The audience seemed almost surprised that the music had ended. For several long seconds, there was nothing but quiet air between the stage and the seats. Then someone in the audience began to clap. Another person joined, and within a moment, the silence exploded into applause that filled the entire hall. The applause grew louder and louder until it filled every corner of the hall. It was not the short, polite clapping that most contestants received. This applause felt different, carried surprise, excitement, and something deeper that people could not easily explain. The girl slowly lifted her hands from the piano keys. For a moment she remained seated, almost as if she was still listening to the music in her mind. The bright stage lights shone softly across the polished surface of the grand piano. When she finally stood up from the bench, the applause continued. She turned toward the audience and gave a small respectful bow. Her movements were simple and calm. There was no dramatic gesture, no attempt to draw attention to herself. She simply showed quiet appreciation for the people who had listened. From the front rows, several people stood up while clapping. Soon more people followed. Within seconds, a large part of the audience was on their feet. The girl looked slightly surprised. She had not expected such a strong reaction. Her eyes moved briefly across the crowd. Then she looked down again with a modest smile. Near the judges' table, the three judges exchanged thoughtful glances. One of them adjusted his glasses and leaned closer to the microphone, though he did not speak yet. He seemed to be thinking carefully about what he had just heard. Another judge quietly tapped a pencil on the table, not out of impatience but out of habit while processing something important. Finally, the host stepped forward toward the center of the stage. He waited patiently for the applause to calm down before speaking. "That was a beautiful interpretation," he said warmly. "Thank you for sharing it with us." The audience responded with another round of clapping. The girl nodded politely and stepped away from the piano, preparing to walk off the stage. But before she could reach the stairs, one of the judges raised a hand slightly. "Just a moment," he said. The hall became quiet again as people waited to hear what the judge would say. The girl stopped and turned back toward the judge's table. The judge leaned forward slightly and spoke in a calm, thoughtful voice. When we asked you to play the simplest tune, he said, we expected something very short and basic. What you gave us was something very different. A few audience members nodded quietly. The judge continued, you kept the melody simple, just as we asked. But you also showed creativity and emotion. That is not something we see every day. The girl listened respectfully without interrupting. Another judge joined the conversation. Your timing was very natural, she said. You allowed the melody to breathe. That is something many advanced performers forget to do. The girl felt her face grow slightly warm under the lights, but she stayed calm. The first judge looked at a small paper in front of him. May we ask you a question? He said. Yes, the girl replied softly. Did someone teach you to arrange that melody in that way? He asked. The girl hesitated for a brief moment before answering honestly. No, she said. I practiced the tune many times at home. Sometimes I just tried different sounds to see how it could change. A quiet murmur passed through the audience. The judges looked at one another again. The second judge smiled gently. So you experimented with it on your own? She asked. The girl nodded. Yes, I like to see how small ideas can grow into something bigger. That simple answer seemed to impress the judges even more. The first judge leaned back in his chair and folded his hands together. For a moment he simply observed the performer standing on stage. Behind the stage entrance, several contestants were still watching closely. They whispered quietly among themselves. One of them said, I thought it was just a beginner tune. Another replied, it was, but she turned it into something else. Back on stage, the host smiled and thanked the girl again for her performance. You may return to your seat now, he said kindly. The girl nodded once more and walked carefully down the stage steps. As she passed the front row, several audience members gave her encouraging smiles. One older man even gave a small respectful nod, as if acknowledging the effort behind the performance. She returned to the row where her mother was sitting. The moment she sat down, her mother gently held her hand. No words were needed. The proud expression in her eyes said everything. The girl finally allowed herself to relax slightly. But the competition was not finished yet. Several contestants still needed to perform. The host soon called the next performer to the stage. Another talented pianist walked forward confidently and began playing a complex classical piece filled with fast runs and dramatic chords. The performance was technically impressive. The performer's fingers moved rapidly across the keyboard, and the audience applauded politely when the piece ended. Yet something felt different in the atmosphere of the hall now. The earlier performance still lingered in people's minds. During the next performance, a few audience members quietly whispered about the melody they had just heard. That simple tune was beautiful, someone said softly. Another replied, it was not about difficulty. It was about feeling. At the judges' table, the judges returned to writing notes again. But every now and then, one of them glanced briefly toward the row where the girl was sitting. They were still thinking about her interpretation of the melody. More contestants performed after that. Some played very challenging pieces that required great technical skill. Others performed dramatic compositions filled with powerful emotion. Each performance received applause. But the mood of the audience had changed slightly. People were no longer focused only on complexity or speed. They were listening more carefully for emotion and creativity. In a quiet way, the girl's performance had already influenced how the rest of the competition was being experienced. The girl herself sat quietly beside her mother, watching the stage like everyone else. She did not appear to be thinking about scores or rankings. Instead, she simply listened to the music. One contestant played a fast and energetic piece that made the audience clap along with the rhythm. Another played a slow, emotional composition that filled the hall with dramatic tension. The competition continued steadily as the afternoon moved forward. Eventually, the final contestant finished performing. The host returned to the stage once again. Thank you to all of our talented performers today, he announced. The audience applauded warmly for every contestant who had participated. Now, the host continued, the judges will take a short break to review their scores and decide the final results. The judges gathered their papers and quietly left the table, walking toward a nearby room where they could discuss their decisions. As they disappeared behind the door, the hall filled with conversation. Audience members began sharing their thoughts about the performances they had just heard. Many of those conversations returned to the same topic. The simple tune that had unexpectedly captured everyone's attention. And as people talked quietly among themselves, one question seemed to float through the hall again and again. Could such a simple melody really win the entire competition? After the final performer left the stage, the large hall slowly filled with the low hum of conversation. People shifted in their seats, stretching their legs after sitting quietly for so long. Some audience members stood up to walk around while they waited for the results. Others stayed seated, continuing to talk about the performances they had just heard. Near the front rows, several parents discussed their favorite moments from the competition. Some mentioned the fast and dramatic pieces that had filled the hall with energy. Others spoke about the emotional performances that had made the room feel still and thoughtful. Yet one performance kept returning to their conversations again and again. The simple tune that had grown into something unexpected. At the judges' table, the three judges gathered their notes and walked through a side door into a quiet meeting room. The door closed behind them, shutting out the sound of the audience. Inside the room there was a small table, a few chairs, and a window that looked out over the city streets. The judges sat down and placed their papers in front of them. For a moment, none of them spoke. They simply looked through their notes, reviewing the scores they had written during the performances. Finally, one of the judges broke the silence. "We had many strong performers today," he said slowly. The second judge nodded in agreement. Yes, the level of skill was very high. The third judge leaned back in her chair and folded her arms thoughtfully. "But one performance felt different," she said. The other two judges looked up immediately. They already knew which performance she meant. The first judge glanced down at the sheet in front of him. On that page were several notes written quickly during the earlier performance. "Creativity," he read quietly. "Natural timing. Emotional understanding." He looked up again. "That simple melody surprised me." The second judge smiled slightly. It surprised everyone. They began reviewing the other performances as well. Some contestants had shown impressive technical skill. Their pieces were fast, complex, and difficult to perform. But the judges spoke carefully about what truly made a performance memorable. "It's not only about difficulty," the third judge said gently. "Music must also connect with people." The first judge nodded. "We asked for the simplest tune," he said, "and what we received was a lesson in musical imagination." Meanwhile, back in the hall, the contestants sat in different groups waiting for the results. Some were talking with their teachers. Others sat quietly, thinking about their performances. The girl who had played the simple tune sat beside her mother once again. Her hands rested calmly in her lap. She was not speaking much, but her eyes remained focused on the stage. Her mother noticed the quiet expression on her face. "You did very well," she said softly. The girl gave a small smile. "I just played what I felt," she replied. Around them, a few other contestants occasionally glanced in their direction. Some recognized her from the earlier performance and gave polite smiles. One young pianist walked over and spoke kindly. "That was beautiful," he said. "I've never heard that tune played like that before." The girl thanked him quietly. The conversation in the hall continued to grow louder as more people shared their thoughts. Near the back rows, two music teachers were discussing the performances. "One player had incredible speed," one said. "Yes," the other replied. "But the melody earlier, that stayed in my mind." Back in the judges' room, the discussion continued. They reviewed each score carefully, making sure their final decision was fair. The judges respected every contestant who had taken the stage that day. Still, the conversation kept returning to the same performance. "The audience reaction was very strong," one judge said. "And not just because it was unexpected," another added. "People felt the music." The third judge tapped her pencil lightly against the table. "That is what great musicians do," she said. They make people feel something. After some time, the judges began arranging their score sheets into a final ranking. They reviewed the top performers once more. Several contestants had excellent scores, but one name slowly moved toward the top of the list. Back in the hall, the host stepped onto the stage again. The microphone carried his voice clearly across the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience," he said warmly. "The judges are finishing their final discussion." The audience quieted slightly, though excitement continued to grow. Some people leaned forward in their seats. Others whispered their predictions. "Who do you think will win?" someone asked quietly. "I'm not sure," another replied. But that simple melody was unforgettable. The girl heard a few of these conversations but remained calm. She did not want to think too much about the results. For her, the most important moment had already passed. She had been able to share her music. That alone felt meaningful. Her mother gently squeezed her hand again. "No matter what happens," she said softly, "you should be proud." The girl nodded. On the stage, the host looked toward the side door where the judges had disappeared earlier. A few seconds later, the door opened. The three judges stepped back into the hall, carrying their papers with them. The audience immediately grew quiet again. People straightened in their seats, waiting for the announcement. The judges returned to their table and sat down. The host received a sealed envelope from one of them. He held it carefully and walked back to the center of the stage. The room felt very still. Even the contestants who had been chatting earlier now watched closely. The host looked out across the audience with a small smile. "Today we heard many wonderful performances," he said. "Every contestant showed dedication, courage, and love for music." The audience responded with warm applause. He waited for the clapping to settle before continuing. "But one performance reminded us of something very important," he said slowly. The girl's mother felt her heart begin to beat faster. The host carefully opened the envelope. Everyone in the hall held their breath, waiting to hear the name inside. And in that quiet moment, it felt as if the entire competition had led to this single announcement. The hall was so quiet that even the small sound of the envelope opening could be heard. Hundreds of people sat still, waiting for the final result. Some contestants held their breath. Others stared at the stage with nervous excitement. The host slowly unfolded the paper inside the envelope. He glanced at the name written there, then looked up at the audience with a warm smile. "For our judges," he began calmly, "today's competition was not only about playing the most difficult music, it was about understanding music." The audience listened carefully. Every performer who came to this stage showed dedication and courage. Each of you worked hard to reach this moment. A few contestants nodded quietly. The host paused for a moment, letting his words settle. "But one performance reminded us that music does not always need to be complicated to be powerful." The girl sitting beside her mother felt her hands grow slightly warm. She was not thinking about winning, but something about those words made her heart beat faster. The host looked down at the paper again. "The winner of today's competition," he said clearly, "is the performer who transformed a very simple tune into something truly unforgettable." For a brief second, the hall felt frozen in time. Then the host spoke the number of the contestant. The girl's number. A wave of applause burst across the hall almost instantly. Some people even stood up again, clapping with excitement. The girl sat still for a moment, almost unsure if she had heard correctly. Her mother gently touched her arm and smiled with proud eyes. "You should go," her mother whispered softly. The girl slowly stood up. Her legs felt slightly unsteady, but she began walking toward the stage as the applause continued. Several contestants smiled and clapped as she passed them. One even gave a quick, encouraging nod. When she reached the stage steps, the host welcomed her with a friendly handshake. The bright lights above the stage felt warmer than before, but the girl remained calm. The audience continued clapping as she stepped forward. One of the judges stood up from the table and walked toward her, holding a small trophy. It was simple but elegant, shining under the lights. "Congratulations," the judge said kindly as he handed it to her. The girl accepted it carefully with both hands. The applause slowly softened, though many people were still smiling. The judge turned toward the microphone and addressed the audience. "Today we heard many talented performers," he said. "Some played very fast pieces. Some played very difficult compositions. All of them worked hard." He paused and glanced toward the young performer beside him. "But sometimes music teaches us an important lesson. It reminds us that feeling and creativity matter just as much as technique." A quiet agreement moved through the audience. "When we asked for the simplest tune," the judge continued, "we did not expect to hear something so thoughtful. This performance showed imagination, patience, and heart." The audience responded with another round of applause. The girl held the trophy close to her chest. She felt grateful but also a little shy about the attention. The host smiled and asked gently, "Would you like to say a few words?" The girl hesitated for a moment. Speaking in front of so many people felt more difficult than playing the piano. Still, she stepped closer to the microphone. Her voice was soft but clear. "I just wanted to play the melody the way I felt it," she said simply. The audience listened quietly. "At home I practice on an old piano. Sometimes I play the same tune many times and try different ideas. I never thought those little ideas would bring me here." A few people in the audience smiled warmly. The girl continued, "I think simple music can be very beautiful if you listen carefully to it." Her honest words touched many people in the room. The judges nodded in appreciation. The host thanked her again and invited the audience to give one more round of applause for all the contestants. The hall filled with clapping once more. After a few photos were taken, the girl stepped down from the stage and returned to her seat. Her mother hugged her tightly, proud and emotional. "You did something special today," her mother said quietly. The girl smiled, still holding the small trophy. Around them, people continued talking about the performance they had heard earlier. Some audience members said it reminded them why they loved music in the first place. A music teacher near the front rows spoke to his students. "Remember this moment," he told them. "Music is not only about playing more notes. It is about understanding the notes you play." The competition slowly came to an end as people began leaving their seats. Some contestants packed their music sheets. Others congratulated one another before heading toward the exit. The girl and her mother walked slowly through the hall together. A few people stopped them to say kind words about the performance. One older man said, "That melody will stay in my mind for a long time." The girl thanked him politely. Outside the building, the evening air felt calm and cool. The sky above the city was beginning to turn orange as the sun moved lower. The girl stood for a moment near the entrance, looking back at the tall music hall. Earlier that day she had arrived feeling nervous and uncertain. Now she felt peaceful. Winning the competition was exciting, but the most important part was something else. She had shared her music with others, and people had truly listened. Her mother placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Ready to go home?" she asked. The girl nodded. As they walked toward their car, the girl thought again about the simple tune she had played. It was still the same melody she had practiced many times at home. Nothing about it had changed, but today it had shown something powerful. Even the simplest music can become something extraordinary when it is played with creativity, patience, and heart. And sometimes the smallest melody can leave the biggest memory.